A 6-year-old stepped behind a low ridge to prank his brothers, and in the 3 minutes it took them to circle back, he was gone. Spence Field, June 14, 1969. It launched the largest search in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains. 1,400 people across 56 square miles, and they found nothing. Not a shoe. This is the most visited national park in America, a range so old and worn that people call it gentle. The easy answer is that the forest is dense enough to swallow you in a few steps. The easy answer is wrong. Why? Because gentle is a word people use for these mountains when they look at a map. On paper, the southern Appalachians read as friendly. No jagged peaks scraping the clouds, no permanent snowfields, no knife-edge ridges that make climbers write out their wills. The tallest point in the whole chain, Mount Mitchell, stands at 6,684 feet, which would not crack the top 1,000 summits in the American West. These are old mountains, some of the oldest on Earth, and age has rounded them down the way a river rounds a stone. That rounding is exactly what fools people. Because the same forces that wore these mountains down did not make them safe. They made them intricate. They carved a labyrinth. And they had an almost unimaginable amount of time to do the carving. These mountains were once young and high, on the scale of the Alps or the Himalaya, hundreds of millions of years ago, before there were flowers or birds, and every year since then the rain has been quietly taking them apart. That is the part the word old fails to carry. Old does not mean tired and harmless. It means finished, fully worked, every weakness in the rock already found and cut, the whole range refined by deep time into about the most efficient possible arrangement of ridges and drainages for shedding water and confusing anything that walks into it. A young mountain range is crude and obvious, a raw wall you can see over and around. An old one like this is a machine that has had 300 million years of edits, and it is very, very good at what it does. Understand what erosion actually does to a mountain range over hundreds of millions of years. It does not simply lower the peaks. Water finds every seam of weakness in the rock and cuts down into it again and again. For a span of time the human mind cannot really hold. Every rainstorm since before the dinosaurs has been quietly editing this terrain. The result is not a smooth slope. The result is a dense, repeating maze of ridges and hollows, thousands of them, folded against each other like the crumpled edge of a piece of paper. From a summit, it can look like a frozen green ocean, ridge after ridge fading into blue haze. That haze, by the way, is where the name comes from. The trees exhale organic compounds that scatter light, and the whole range wears a permanent smoky blue veil. It is beautiful. It is also the first hint that the air itself here is doing something. Start with the scale, because the scale is part of the deception. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park draws somewhere between 12 and 14 million recorded visits in a year, more than the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, and Yellowstone combined. It is not a wilderness in the way people picture wilderness. There is no permit rationed to a lucky few, no multi-day approach, march just to reach the boundary. You drive in. Millions of people pass through in flip-flops and rental cars, pull over at an overlook, buy fudge in Gatlinburg and drive home. And that ease of access is exactly what strips the fear out of the place. A mountain you can drive over does not feel like a mountain that can kill you. And yet inside that same boundary sits some of the most rugged, trackless, vertical terrain in the eastern half of the country, 500,000 acres of it. And the fudge shop and the labyrinth are separated by a few hundred yards and one wrong turn off a trail. That is the whole problem in a sentence. The danger is not far away and exotic. It is right up against the parking lot. And the parking lot is what people believe. Then there is the number that should reset your sense of the place entirely. People hear old, worn, rounded, and they picture soft, forgiving slopes. But the relief in these mountains, the The vertical distance between the valley floors and the ridge tops runs to thousands of feet, and it is packed into horizontal distances so short that the slopes are punishing. A hollow floor at 1,500 feet can be walled by a ridge topping 5,000 and 6,000 feet, only a mile or two away. That is not gentle. That is a wall wearing a green coat. Erosion did not flatten these mountains. It dissected them, cutting down and down along every fracture in the ancient rock until what remained was a tangle of steep-sided ridges and deep, dark ravines, folded so tightly together that from the air, the range looks less like mountains than like a crumpled cloth. The gentleness is entirely on the map. On the ground, off the trail, it is a near vertical world with the sight lines of a closet, and that combination, steep enough to exhaust you and blind enough to lose you, is not an accident of this landscape. It is the landscape's defining feature. And the moisture never really leaves. This is one of the wettest regions in the continental United States outside the Pacific Northwest, and the high country wrings rain and cloud out of the passing air almost constantly. The forest that grows in that wet is a temperate rainforest in all but name, one of the most biologically dense places on the continent. And that density is not just a fact for biologists. It is the physical wall a lost person runs into. Every additional foot of undergrowth is another foot of sight line gone. The rain that feeds the forest is the same rain that swells the streams that block the searchers. The cloud that keeps the forest wet is the same cloud that drops onto the ridges and blinds anyone caught on them. Nothing here is decorative. Every beautiful thing about these mountains is also a mechanism, and the mechanisms all point the same direction, which is away from the lost and toward the terrain. Now put a person inside that maze, off the trail, and watch what the geography does to them. This is the mechanism, and it is worth slowing down for because everything that follows in this story is built on it. A lost person needs a reference point, something fixed to steer by, a distant peak, a shoreline, the sun, a road, a river running in a known direction. The southern Appalachian forest strips all of those away at once. The canopy overhead is a solid ceiling in summer, so the sun disappears. The ridges all look the same height, same shape, same trees, so there is no landmark to fix on. And the understory is where it turns cruel. There is a plant here called rhododendron, and in places mountain laurel, and where they take over a slope, they form what locals have called, for 200 years, a laurel hell. The name is not poetry, it is a warning. These are not delicate garden shrubs. They grow into dense, waxy, interlocking thickets, 10 and 15 feet tall, with trunks that twist and cross and weave into a nearly solid wall. A person can push into a laurel hell and within a few dozen feet, lose the ability to see more than an arm's length in any direction. You cannot see the sky. You cannot see the ground you came from. You cannot see the ridge you were trying to reach. Sound deadens. Distance stops meaning anything. Rescuers have described crawling through these thickets on hands and knees, sometimes over the tops of the branches because the ground is impassable, moving a few hundred yards in an hour. Now imagine you are 6 years old, and it is getting dark, and every direction looks exactly like every other direction. Here is what a disoriented person does, and it is one of the most consistent findings in the entire study of lost person behavior. They drift downhill. It is not a decision. It is gravity acting on exhaustion. Going down is easier than going up, and every step downhill feels like progress, like you must be heading towards something. A stream, a valley, a road. So the lost person leaves the ridge, where they might have been found, and descends into a hollow, where they cannot. And the drainages in these mountains do not run straight. They branch, A single ridge can shed water into a dozen separate hollows, each one leading somewhere different, most of them leading nowhere a searcher would think to look, which means the search area does not grow in a neat circle around the last known point. It explodes. Every hour a lost person keeps moving. The zone that must be searched expands not by addition, but by something closer to multiplication, because now the searchers have to account for every fork that person might have taken. Time is the enemy, and in this terrain time moves against the searchers faster than almost anywhere else on the continent. Make that geometry concrete, because it is the engine under every disappearance in this film. Say a person walks off a trail, and before they realize they are lost, keeps moving for 1 hour at the slow, stumbling pace. This terrain forces perhaps a mile, perhaps less. To find them, searchers now have to cover a circle roughly a mile in every direction from the last known point, and the area of a circle grows with the square of its radius, so that 1 hour of wandering has already created something like 3 square miles to comb. Let the person move for 3 hours before anyone even knows to look, which is entirely normal, and the circle is now 3 miles out and the area has ballooned toward 30 square miles. Every hour does not add ground. It multiplies it. And this is the flat, honest version that assumes the person walks in a tidy circle, which they do not because in these mountains they follow the drainages, and the drainages branch, and each fork is another place the searchers must account for. This is why a search that starts within an hour has a real chance, and a search that starts after dark, in the rain, is very often already lost before the first team steps into the woods. The mountain is not just hiding the person. It is expanding the haystack faster than any number of hands can search it, and it does this while blinding the searchers as thoroughly as it blinds the lost. Step into a laurel hell yourself, and the numbers stop being abstract. The branches interlock at chest and head height. The ground beneath is a chaos of roots and rotting blowdown, and progress becomes a matter of forcing your body through gaps that close behind you, or crawling along the tops of the branches because the floor is impassable. Searchers in these thickets have measured their progress not in miles per hour, but in feet, sometimes a few hundred feet in an hour. Soaked, scratched, unable to see a teammate 10 feet away, unable to be sure they have actually covered the ground they just crossed. Now overlay that on 30 square miles, and you understand why 1,400 people found nothing. It was never a question of will. It was a question of a landscape that swallows sight lines, multiplies ground, and runs out the clock all at once on everyone who enters it, rescuer and victim alike. The people who lived in these mountains first understood this in their bones. The Cherokee had inhabited these ridges and hollows for thousands of years, and their relationship to the terrain was not sentimental. It was a working system of survival knowledge, refined over more generations than any European had been on the continent. Stay on the ridge lines. The ridges are the highways. They connect, they drain. They give you sight lines when sight lines exist, and they keep you out of the trap of the hollows. Do not travel in fog. When the cloud comes down onto the ridge, and in these mountains, the cloud comes down onto the ridge constantly, you stop, because moving blind in this terrain is how you die. This was not superstition. It was an observation system built on the accumulated deaths and near deaths of a people who had no margin for error and no helicopter coming. Read the water, read the weather, read the light, and match your movement to the land instead of forcing the land to match your schedule. The settlers who came later, and the tourists who came later still, brought a different assumption, that the schedule was fixed and the land would cooperate. The land does not cooperate. That difference between adapting to the mountains and forcing them onto an outside schedule is the quiet fault line under every death in this story, and it is worth naming plainly. The old knowledge was built around the land's terms. You do not cross the ridge in the fog. You wait for the fog to lift, even if that costs you a day, because a day is cheaper than your life. You read the water before you ford it. You move when the mountain lets you move. But almost everyone who dies in these mountains dies on an outside clock. The family has the long weekend, and the long weekend is when they will camp, rain or shine. The through hiker has a season, a narrow window before the northern winter closes the trail, and every day of delay is a day against the finish. The tourist has driven a long way to stand on the summit, and the gift shop closes at a set hour, and the mountain's weather is not consulted. The coal has to be dug on the company's schedule, and the waste has to go somewhere now, not after a proper dam is engineered. Over and over, the pattern is the same, a human timetable, fixed in advance, laid across a landscape that keeps its own time and does not negotiate. The mountains are not malicious. They are simply indifferent, running on a clock measured in storms and seasons and geological ages, and the people who get hurt are almost always the ones who arrived with a plan that assumed the mountain would wait. It does not wait. The old knowledge was not a set of superstitions, but a working instrument panel made out of the world itself. The rising note of the creek at night told you the rain upstream was already on its way down. The way the clouds sat onto one particular ridge told you which passes had closed. The shift of the wind, the quality of the light, the animals moving down off the high ground before a storm, all of it was data, read by people who had no other forecast and could not afford to be wrong. Losing that literacy is part of how modern people die out here. We traded a lifetime of reading the land for a phone that loses signal and a schedule that never does, and we call that progress. And in almost every way it is, except the one way that kills. The land is still sending the same signals it always sent, and fewer of the people walking into it can read a single one. Which brings us back to a warm Saturday afternoon in June of 1969 and a family named Martin. They came up nearly every year. The Martins of Knoxville had a tradition of hiking into the high country of the Smokies on Father's Day weekend. And this year they had climbed to Spence Field, a grassy bald along the state line ridge at around 5,000 feet, right where the Appalachian Trail runs the spine of the mountains between Tennessee and North Carolina. A bald in these mountains is one of the rare open meadows on an otherwise forested ridge, and Spence Field is a broad one, a place where the trees pull back and you can actually see. It felt safe. It was the kind of place where you could let children run. William Martin, the father, an architect, was there with his own father and two of his sons, Dennis, who was 6, and his older brother. In the late afternoon, a handful of children, including Dennis and some boys from another family, cooked up a small prank. They would split into groups, circle around, and jump out to startle the adults, boys being boys. Dennis went one way, the other children went another. The plan was that they would all pop out at once, and in the few minutes that took, the estimates run from 3 to 5 minutes, no more, Dennis simply did not come back. The other boys reappeared. Dennis did not. At first, no one panicked, because at first there was no reason to. He was near the meadow. He had wandered off for a moment. William Martin walked the edge of the clearing, calling his son's name, expecting the boy to step out of the trees grinning, proud of how well he had hidden. He did not step out. And this is the first and most important thing to understand about how these disappearances begin. The gap between "he's around here somewhere" and "something is very wrong" is agonizingly small, and by the time it closes, the terrain has already done its work. Dennis had a head start measured in minutes, and in this landscape, a head start measured in minutes is enough. William Martin did the thing any father does. He went in after his son. He plunged into the forest below the bald, calling, searching, and in doing so he lost time and he lost daylight. And he later worried, as any parent would, that he had trampled the very tracks that might have led searchers to the boy. By evening, The family knew this was no longer a matter of a hiding child. Someone hiked out to raise the alarm, and then the weather, which had been a background character, walked to the center of the stage. Because that night it began to rain. It rained hard, and it kept raining. Over the following days, the search would be repeatedly hammered by storms. The streams that lace these mountains swelled and turned brown and violent. Trails washed out. The dirt roads that searchers needed to move people and supplies up into the high country turned to running mud and, in places, became impassable. Think about what that does to a rescue. Every hour matters, and here was weather actively stealing hours, slowing the searchers, erasing the ground evidence, swelling the streams into barriers, and worst of all, threatening a small child who was somewhere out in it with no shelter, no jacket, and no way to keep warm. A dry June night at 5,000 feet in these mountains is already cold enough to kill a soaked 6-year-old. A wet one is far worse. The rain was not a complication to the search for Dennis Martin. It was, quite possibly, part of what killed him, and it announced early what this whole story is going to keep proving. In these mountains, the terrain and the weather do not take turns. They work together. Watch how a rescue actually scales, because the comforting myth is that help arrives, and the comforting myth is wrong. On that first night, it was a handful of family members and a few rangers with flashlights, working uphill against the rain, calling a name into a forest that swallowed the sound. By the next day, it was rangers and local volunteers. Within days, it had swollen into hundreds and then past 1,000 as word spread, and the newspapers picked up the story of the little boy lost in the Smokies, and people drove in from across the region to help. That sounds like an advantage. It is not a simple one. A search is not stronger just because it is bigger. Hundreds of untrained, well-meaning volunteers tramping through the search area in the rain can destroy exactly the faint sign, a partial footprint, a bent stem, a thread of scent that a trained tracker or a dog needs to cut a trail. The people running the search knew this, and they were caught in an impossible trade-off that runs through every mass search in history. Refuse the crowd and lose the manpower, or accept the crowd and risk trampling the only evidence that could point the way. With a child's life measured in hours, they took the manpower. Some of the trackers who arrived later believed the ground around the bald had already been churned past reading before they ever got there. The boy's faint trail erased not by the mountain, but by the boots of the people trying to save him. And the searchers were not working in safety themselves. The same storms that were hampering the search were turning the streams they had to cross into brown, fast, waist-deep torrents, and the same steep, slick, laurel-choked ground that had swallowed the boy was now being worked, in the dark and the rain, by hundreds of exhausted people, many of them with no training for it. Search and rescue in this terrain is never a one-sided act of mercy carried out from a position of safety. It is hundreds of people accepting real danger on bad ground, in bad weather. And in the Dennis Martin search, the mountain that had already taken one child was perfectly capable of taking a searcher too. That is the grim arithmetic every incident commander in these mountains has to weigh. How much risk to the living is a search for the possibly already dead worth? And at what point does calling more people into the labyrinth simply put more people in reach of it? The military came because the civilian effort was hitting a wall. Green Berets, active duty special forces soldiers from Fort Bragg, trained for exactly this kind of terrain and equipped with the electronic sensing gear of the era, were brought in to work ground that was defeating everyone else. The FBI came because a missing child is a federal matter, and because the possibility that Dennis had been taken had to be run down. A helicopter worked the airspace above a canopy so dense it could have hidden a vehicle, let alone a small boy in dark clothes. And still the fundamental arithmetic did not move. Every day Dennis Martin was not found. The area he could have reached grew wider, and the drainages below Spence Field kept doing what drainages do, splitting the possible into more and more branches until the searchable ground outran the searchers, no matter how many of them there were. 1,400 people is a staggering number until you spread it across 56 square miles of laurel and ravine, and then it is one searcher for every several acres in terrain where you cannot see a person standing a few acres away. The science that grew up in the decades after cases like this one has a name for what was happening, and it is worth knowing because it turns an unbearable mystery into an understandable mechanism. It is called lost person behavior, and it is the patient statistical study of what people actually do when they become disoriented, where they go, how far they travel, whether they climb or descend, and how a 6-year-old differs from an adult hiker, a hunter, or a person in crisis. The findings are consistent, and they map with terrible precision onto this landscape. Very young children often do not understand that they are lost the way an adult does. They do not backtrack effectively. They move toward whatever looks interesting or offers shelter. They can cover surprising distances before they stop, and they tend to end up in the hardest possible places to search, in drainages, inside thickets, tucked under overhangs, and blowdown. Every one of those tendencies in this terrain points a small child away from the open bald where he was last seen, and down into the hollows and the laurel, into precisely the ground where 1,000 searchers could pass within yards of him and never know he was there. Measure the theories about Dennis Martin against that mechanism, because none of them can be proven, and all of them have to survive it. The wandering death theory says he did exactly what the behavior science would predict. He drifted downhill into a drainage as the light failed. The first storm-lashed night took a soaked and exhausted child the way cold takes the small and the wet, and he came to rest somewhere. The enormous grid, for all its size, simply never crossed. His remains scattered or covered by weather and time before anyone reached the spot. The abduction theory rests almost entirely on the account of a family named Key, hiking miles away and lower down the mountain that same afternoon, who reported hearing an anguished, guttural sound and, one of them said, glimpsing a rough-looking man moving through the brush, carrying something over his shoulder. In the frantic early days, that report was never fully run down, and once it went cold, it could never be reconstructed. The FBI investigated the possibility of foul play and reported finding no evidence of it. No suspect was ever named. Both theories cannot be true, and perhaps neither is. What is certain is only this: a landscape a few miles from a paved road, inside the most visited national park in America, absorbed a 6-year-old boy so completely that the largest search in its history, backed by the Army and the FBI, produced not one confirmable trace. And more than half a century of theories has not moved the case a single inch toward an answer. The park keeps the file open. The mountain keeps its silence. For the family, there was no ending, which is its own kind of wound. William Martin did not simply go home and grieve. For years he returned to the mountain, chasing tips and theories, unable to let the question close, because a death at least gives you something to bury, and a disappearance gives you nothing but the open door of not knowing. Reports still reach the park across the decades. A set of remains found somewhere in the vast back country, a second-hand story, a theory dusted off and re-examined, and each one is checked, and none has ever closed the case. That is the particular cruelty of the way these mountains take people. They do not only kill. Sometimes they refuse even to confirm the death, and they leave the living to keep searching a labyrinth that has already given its answer and will not say it aloud. And every ranger who has worked a lost person search in the Smokies since has carried the same lesson Dennis Martin taught in 1969. Out here, minutes are miles, and the ground does not give people back. Cases like this one did change how searches are run, and that is exactly what makes the next chapter so unsettling. In the decades after 1969, wilderness search and rescue stopped being a matter of throwing every available body at a mountain and hoping. It became a discipline. Searchers learned to fix a point last seen and to reason outward from it with probabilities rather than crowds, to divide terrain into segments and assign the likelihood that a lost person of a given type, a child, a hiker, a hunter, an older adult, would be found in each. They built statistical databases from thousands of real cases so that a search manager could say with numbers behind it how far a disoriented 6-year-old is likely to have traveled and in which direction the terrain will have pulled them. They learned that flooding the woods with untrained volunteers can do more harm than good, and that a smaller number of trained teams working the highest probability ground methodically will find more people. In other words, we got dramatically better at searching. We turned the guesswork into a science. Hold that thought because it sets up the hardest fact in this entire film. All of that improvement, all of that hard-won expertise was in place and fully mature by the time a retired nurse named Geraldine Largay stepped off the Appalachian Trail in 2013. And it still was not enough. And the reason it was not enough is the reason nothing in this story is ever enough. You can perfect the search. You cannot shorten the distance you cannot shorten distance and you cannot make the terrain give up what it is holding. The search became the largest in the history of the park and one of the largest in the history of the eastern United States. It built over days into a genuine army. Park rangers, sheriff's deputies, the FBI, and eventually Green Berets from Fort Bragg, active duty Special Forces soldiers, joined civilian volunteers who poured in by the hundreds until the crowd numbered, at its peak, somewhere around 1,400 people. They searched an area that grew to roughly 56 square miles of some of the most broken terrain in the East. They used dogs. They used a helicopter. They flooded the hollows below Spence Field with human beings shoulder to shoulder in grid lines, and they found nothing. Nothing that could ever be confirmed as Dennis. No clothing. No remains. No reliable track. A search that size in that terrain, with that much manpower and that much national attention, produced not one solid physical fact about where the boy had gone. 56 square miles and 1,400 searchers, defeated by ridges and hollows and laurel and rain. Let that be the first proof of the thing this whole documentary is built to show you. Nearness to people is not the same as safety. Spence Field is not some remote corner of Alaska. It is a day hike from a major American highway in the most visited national park in the country, ringed by towns, and the terrain still swallowed a child so completely that the single largest search effort the region had ever mounted came up empty. There is a wrinkle to the Dennis Martin case that has haunted it for more than 50 years, and honesty about the evidence requires laying it out plainly because the record here is genuinely unresolved. On that same afternoon, several miles away and lower down, a family named Key was hiking and later reported that they had heard what sounded like an anguished scream, and one of them said he glimpsed a rough-looking man moving through the brush, apparently carrying something over his shoulder. At the time, in the chaos, this report was not fully run down, and by the time investigators tried to reconstruct it, the trail was cold. From it grew a theory that Dennis Martin was not lost at all but taken, abducted. There have been others, that he wandered far and died of exposure in a spot no searcher happened to cross, that his small body was carried off or covered before it could be found, that a wild animal was involved. The FBI investigated and reported finding no evidence of foul play. No abductor was ever identified. No remains were ever recovered to confirm the simplest explanation. So we have to be careful here and say exactly what is true and no more. Dennis Martin walked into the forest at Spence Field on June 14, 1969, and was never seen again. And after more than half a century, we still do not know what happened to him. The theories remain theories. The mountain kept its answer. For a long time, it was possible to file a case like that under the limitations of the era. No cell phones, no GPS, no satellite messengers, paper maps and dogs and shouting. Surely you think the problem was technology or the lack of it. Surely a modern hiker, with a phone in one pocket and a GPS in the other, could not simply vanish 2 miles from a marked trail in a landscape crawling with other people. Surely we fixed this. We did not fix this. And the proof is a woman named Geraldine Largay. She went by the trail name Inchworm. She was 66 years old, a retired nurse from Tennessee, and in 2013 she was attempting one of the great endurance feats an ordinary person can take on, a through hike of the Appalachian Trail, the 2,200-mile footpath that runs the spine of these ancient mountains from Georgia to Maine. Understand how many people this puts on these ridges, because exposure is a numbers game. Something like 3 million people set foot on some part of the Appalachian Trail in a year, and a few thousand each season set out to walk the entire thing end to end, a march that takes most of them 5 to 7 months. Only about 1 in 4 who start a through hike finishes it. This is not a wilderness expedition reserved for elite mountaineers. It is a public footpath, well marked, heavily used, threaded past road crossings and trail towns. And that very accessibility is what fills it with ordinary people, the retired and the young, the fit and the unready, spread out along 2,000 miles of the same low, close, disorienting forest that has run through this whole story. Most of them will have the trip of their lives. A handful, every single year, will step off the path for the most ordinary of reasons and meet the same trap that has been waiting on these mountains since long before there was a trail to walk. She was not reckless. She was not a novice wandering in over her head. She had trained, she had section hiked, she was doing the hard, patient, unglamorous work of walking a continent's worth of ridgeline one day at a time, and she had made it hundreds of miles north, into Maine, into the last, and in some ways, the most rugged stretch of the entire trail. Her husband, George, was supporting her the way many through hikers are supported, meeting her at road crossings with food and a bed and a resupply, then dropping her back at the trail to continue. It was a system. It worked. Until the morning, it did not. Understand where she was, because it explains why the ordinary became fatal. The stretch of the Appalachian Trail in western Maine is, by wide agreement, among the most physically demanding of the whole 2,200 miles, a country of steep, rooty climbs, boggy lowlands, and dense boreal forest of spruce and fir, the kind of woods where the trees grow close and low, and the undergrowth of young evergreens and blowdown forms a wall a few feet off the path. It is not dramatic terrain in the way a western mountain is dramatic. There are no cliffs to fall from, no thin air. It is the same quiet trap as the Smokies in a colder key, repeating, close, low sightline forest, where one step off the marked corridor can put a wall of identical trees between you and the trail. Geraldine Largay was deep into it, hundreds of miles north of where she had started, closing on the end of a journey most people never even attempt. She was not a lost tourist. She was a seasoned long-distance hiker within reach of finishing, which is exactly the kind of person who has learned to trust the routine. And the routine that morning was the most routine thing in the world. On July 22, 2013, in a remote stretch of western Maine near the Poplar Ridge lean-to, Geraldine Largay stepped off the Appalachian Trail to go to the bathroom. That is the entire inciting act. She walked a short distance into the woods, off the path, for privacy, exactly as every long-distance hiker does many times a day. And when she turned to walk back, the trail was not where it should have been. This is the moment the whole first half of our story collapses into a single human being. Everything the Cherokee knew, everything the Dennis Martin search proved, everything about drainage and disorientation in the labyrinth, all of it came for a prepared, experienced 66-year-old woman in the space of a few steps off a marked footpath. The main woods here are not the open balds of the Smokies. They are dense, low, tangled northern forest, thick with spruce and fir and blowdown, with the same problem the southern mountains have: no sight lines, repeating terrain, and an understory that closes behind you like water closing over a dropped stone. She could not see the trail. She could not see far enough in any direction to find it, and the ground again sloped and offered the same false promise it always offers. She did the smart thing first. She had a cell phone, and she used it. She tried to text her husband. The message was direct and calm, and it is one of the most quietly devastating documents in the modern record of these mountains, because it shows a competent person doing exactly the right thing and getting nothing back. She texted George to tell him she was lost, to say she was somewhere north of a stream, to ask him to call the Appalachian Trail Conservancy or the authorities for help, and the message did not send. There was no signal. She was in a dead zone, one of the vast stretches of these mountains where the terrain that hides you from searchers also blocks you from the towers that might have saved you. She tried again. She kept trying, over more than one day, moving to try to find a bar of signal. The texts sat in her phone, undelivered, digital messages in a bottle that never left the harbor. Here is the reversal, and it is a hard one. We told ourselves that the problem in 1969 was that a lost person had no way to call for help. Geraldine Largay had a way to call for help. She had the exact tool we imagined would solve this, and the terrain rendered it useless because a phone is only as good as the invisible web of signal it can reach, and in these mountains, that web has enormous holes, and the holes are precisely the remote low places where a lost hiker is most likely to end up. Communication technology had advanced by decades since Dennis Martin. The distance between a lost person and the people trying to reach them had not shrunk at all. That is the pattern this story keeps uncovering, and you should hold on to it because it is going to get worse before it gets clearer. We keep improving our ability to know and to call, and we keep failing to improve our ability to actually reach. When George Largay did not hear from his wife at the road crossing where he was supposed to meet her, a search began. Picture the start of it from his side, because it is its own quiet agony. George Largay was the entire support system, the man who met her at the road crossings with food and a bed and drove her back to the trail. And on the day she vanished, he was waiting at a rendezvous she never reached. When a hiker is a day late in this country, it can mean nothing at all. A slow stretch, a missed turn, a night camped early, and so there is a terrible lag built into the very beginning of the response, a span of hours in which the one person who could raise the alarm is instead telling himself she is fine and simply behind schedule. By the time the waiting hardened into certainty and the search was launched, she had already been off the trail for the better part of 2 days, alone, trying to send messages that would never leave her phone. The search did not start late through anyone's failure. It started late because that is how these disappearances work. The gap between missing and known to be missing is precisely the head start the terrain needs. And the Maine Warden Service, which handles this kind of search and rescue and is very good at it, threw enormous resources at the problem. Wardens, volunteers, aircraft, and dog teams combed the forest. The documented case file the Warden Service eventually compiled ran to more than 1,500 pages. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. The detail that ties Geraldine Largay directly to Dennis Martin across 44 years and hundreds of miles. At least one search dog team passed within about 100 yards of where she was. 100 yards. The length of a football field. In that forest, 100 yards might as well be 100 miles, because the same dense understory that hid her from her own eyes hid her from the searcher's eyes, and swirling wind in broken terrain can lift, a scent up and over a dog's nose entirely. They were nearly on top of her, and the terrain still held. It is worth being precise about how a dog can fail at 100 yards, because it is the same physics that governs everything else on these mountains. Only now it is working against a nose instead of an eye. A tracking or air scent dog follows a plume of human scent drifting on moving air. But air in this broken terrain does not move in a clean, reliable sheet. It pools in the hollows overnight. It lifts along the warming slopes as the day heats up. It swirls and eddies around every ridge and thicket, and it can carry a scent cone straight up and over a searching dog, or shred it into nothing. The same dense understory that had blocked Geraldine Largay's own eyes blocked and scrambled the very scent that might have led a dog to her. The Maine Warden Service did not fail for lack of skill or effort. They ran an enormous, professional, sustained operation, with aircraft, dog teams, and ground searchers grinding through some of the most difficult country in the East. And the terrain and the weather did to them precisely what those same forces had done to 1,400 searchers in Tennessee 44 years earlier. The tools had improved by decades. The distance had not shortened by a foot. We know a great deal about what happened next because Geraldine Largay kept a journal, and that journal was recovered. And it changes this from a story about a search into a story about a survival, a long, disciplined, heartbreaking one. She did not panic and run, which is what disoriented people so often do and which almost always makes things worse. She stopped. She made a camp. She set up her tent in a small clearing on a wooded rise, and she stayed put, which is precisely what survival experts tell lost people to do. Because a stationary person is findable, and a moving person expands the search into infinity. She rationed. She tried to signal. She kept writing. Her journal records the days ticking by, and it records that she survived alone in that camp for at least 26 days. 26 days. Her final dated entry was August 18th, nearly a month after she stepped off the trail. In it, she asked that whoever found her body contact her husband and her daughter, so that they would know. She had done everything right, and she understood with terrible clarity how it was going to end, and she faced it with a composure that is almost unbearable to read about. She was not found that summer. She was not found that fall. The active search wound down without success, and Geraldine Largay joined the ranks of the mountain's unsolved disappearances, another prepared person swallowed by terrain a stone's throw from a trail walked by thousands. It was more than 2 years, October of 2015, before the answer came, and it came almost by accident. A forester surveying land came upon her camp. Her remains, her tent, and her journal were there, at a site that turned out to be on property used by the U.S. Navy for survival training, which is its own bitter irony. And the location closed the case with a fact that lands like a hammer. She was found roughly 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail. 2 miles. She had survived nearly a month 100 yards from a dog team. 2 miles from one of the most heavily traveled hiking trails in the world. In a state with an expert rescue service, in the 21st century, with a phone in her hand. And the mountains still won. Her case changed a few things, in the small, practical ways these disappearances sometimes do. The undelivered text messages became a widely told warning about the false confidence a phone gives you in the backcountry, about the enormous dead zones that riddle even the most famous trails, and about why a satellite messenger, a device that ignores the cellular network entirely and can push a distress signal straight to orbit from the bottom of any hollow, has since become standard gear for serious long-distance hikers. The exact place where she stepped off the trail fed conversations about trail signage and about the danger of the simplest act in the woods, walking a few yards off the path to relieve yourself. But no sign nailed to a tree and no gadget clipped to a pack repeals the law underneath it. The technology improved what she could know and what she could try. It did nothing to shorten the ground between her and the people looking for her. And in this terrain, that ground was the whole difference between a rescue and a recovery. So take the two cases together, because together they prove something neither proves alone. A 6-year-old with no equipment vanished in 3 minutes in 1969. A 66-year-old expert with a cell phone survived 26 days and still died within earshot of rescue in 2013. The victims could not be more different. The trap was identical. Terrain that erases reference. An understory that closes behind you. A downhill drift into hollows that multiply the search. And a technology that improved everything except the one thing that mattered, which was the raw physical distance between a person in trouble and the people who could help. That distance is the killer. Hold that word, distance, because we are about to leave the problem of the lost individual and confront the problem of mass death. And to do that, we have to answer a question the last 2 stories raised and did not settle. If terrain alone can defeat armies of searchers and disorient the best prepared hiker, what happens when you add real weather? Not a June rainstorm slowing a search, real, engineered, world record violence. For that, we have to climb higher and go north to a mountain that is not tall and is nonetheless one of the deadliest patches of ground in North America. Mount Washington is 6,288 feet high. Write that number down and then throw it away because it will lie to you. There are mountains in Colorado where 6,000 feet is the elevation of the parking lot. Mount Washington would not rank in the top 1,000 summits by height in the lower 48, let alone on Earth. It is a bump. It is a modest granite high point in the presidential range of the White Mountains of New Hampshire, in the same worn old Appalachian system we have been walking this whole time. And it has killed more than 135 people since record-keeping began in the 1800s, with new names added nearly every year. On a summit you can, on a calm summer day, literally drive to. There is a road, there is a cog railway, there is a snack bar and a gift shop at the top, and people die getting there, in numbers that shame mountains 3 and 4 times its height. The obvious explanation that it is dangerous because it is tall is not just incomplete. It is completely wrong. Mount Washington is barely tall at all. So we have to ask the real question, the one that cracks this whole story open. How does a mountain this short manufacture weather that has been measured as, by at least one famous benchmark, the worst on the planet? The answer is position, and it is a beautiful and terrifying piece of physics once you see it. Mount Washington sits at a place where the map itself conspires against calm. 3 major storm tracks, the systems that sweep across the North American continent, tend to converge over New England, funneling weather from the Atlantic, from the Gulf, and from the interior of the continent towards this one region. That alone would make the area stormy. But then the terrain takes that raw weather and does to the wind exactly what the hollows do to lost people. It channels it. The presidential range rises as a barrier across the path of the wind, and the surrounding valleys and notches act like nozzles. When moving air hits a mountain, it has nowhere to go but up and over, and as it squeezes over the ridge it accelerates, the same way a river speeds up where its channel narrows, the same way wind screams between 2 city towers. The mountain does not just experience the wind, it amplifies it. It builds its own weather on top of whatever the continent sends. Take the 3 storm tracks one at a time because their convergence is the whole secret. Weather systems crossing North America tend to follow preferred paths. One sweeps down out of the interior in the Great Lakes. One rides up the Atlantic seaboard as coastal storms, and one carries moisture northeast out of the Gulf and the lower Mississippi Valley. For much of the continent, these are separate stories that pass at separate times. Over New England, they have a statistical habit of arriving together, and the northern presidential range sits almost exactly where their paths tend to cross. That means the summit does not merely get bad weather. It gets the collisions, the places where a cold system and a moisture-laden system meet and fight. And those collisions are where the atmosphere does its most violent work. Then the terrain sharpens what the collision delivers. Air funneling through the deep notches that cut the range. Crawford Notch, Pinkham Notch, the great gaps in the wall, is squeezed and accelerated the way a thumb over a hose speeds the water. And the summit, standing above the notches, catches the full brunt of that accelerated flow. It is a machine with two stages. The continent aims three loaded weather systems at one small region, and the mountains take whatever arrives and press it into something sharper and faster than it was. The result is not a tall mountain's weather, it is a badly placed mountain's weather, and badly placed on this planet beats tall almost every time. And the numbers this produces stopped being numbers a long time ago and became legend, because on April 12th, 1934, the observers at the Summit Observatory clung to a building chained to the rock and measured a wind gust of 231 miles per hour. 231. For more than 60 years, that stood as the highest surface wind speed ever recorded by a human being anywhere on the face of the Earth. A record finally exceeded only in 1996, and only by an unmanned instrument on a remote Australian island during a tropical cyclone. Let me translate 231 miles an hour out of the abstract, because a number like that goes numb in the mind. That is faster than the top speed of most race cars. It is well beyond the wind in the strongest tornadoes and the most violent hurricanes. At that speed, air stops being air. It becomes a physical solid that will knock you flat, tear the skin, drive small stones like buckshot, and rip anything not bolted to bedrock off the mountain. And the men in that observatory were not passing through. They lived up there in winter on purpose to take the measurements. And when the gust hit, they had to time their movements to the lulls just to survive going outside to clear the instruments. Understand what that morning actually demanded of them? Because it makes the number real. The observers on the summit on the 12th of April 1934 were staff of the Mount Washington Observatory, a scientific station perched on the summit and built, quite literally, to be chained to the bedrock so that the wind could not carry it off the mountain. They worked there through the winter precisely to record what the summit does when no one else will go near it. That morning the wind was already ferocious, and it kept building through the day. And the observers understood they were watching something historic climb across their instruments. But to trust the reading, they had to go outside and clear rime ice off the anemometer, the spinning cup device that measures wind speed, because in that environment, ice sheaths everything, and a frozen instrument reads low. Going outside meant crawling, roped to the building, timing every movement to the brief lulls between the worst gusts, into a wind that could pick a grown man up off his feet and throw him. They got out. They cleared the ice. They got the reading. 231 miles an hour. Then they crawled back into a building that was shuddering on its foundations and wrote it into the log. And that number stood as the highest wind speed ever measured at the Earth's surface by human hands for the next 62 years. Until an unmanned instrument on a remote Australian island edged past it during a tropical cyclone in 1996. But by now you already understand that the record is a distraction, and the observatory's own daily logs are what prove it. The killing fact about Mount Washington is not the once-in-a-lifetime gust. It is the ordinariness of the violence. The station records hurricane-force winds, 74 miles an hour or more, on better than 100 days in a typical year. It sits buried inside cloud, unable to see its own outbuildings, on the order of 300 days a year. Live with numbers like that, and they stop being weather and become a way of life. The people who staff the summit through the winter measure their days by whether they can safely reach the instruments. Plan every step outside around the gusts, and treat a genuinely calm hour as the exception worth remarking on. When more than 100 days a year bring winds, the rest of the world would evacuate for hurricane-force wind is not an emergency on Mount Washington. It is a Tuesday. That is the fact that should recalibrate your whole sense of the place. The conditions that would be the worst day of a lifetime almost anywhere else are, on this summit, simply the climate. The ordinary background against which the truly extreme days, the ones that add names to the list, are worse still. And the cold arrives with the wind, and the two together do the killing. Because a human body sheds heat to moving air far faster than to still air. When the summit's combined wind chill drops toward 100 degrees below zero, the time a person can survive exposed is not the span of hours a hiker plans a day around. It collapses to minutes. A person caught above tree line, when the cloud drops and the wind rises, is suddenly navigating blind, in cold that is stripping the warmth and the coordination and the judgment out of them, faster than they can grasp that it is happening. On open rock where there is nothing to shelter behind and no way to see the building that would save them, even when it stands only a few hundred yards off. Hypothermia does not announce itself. It arrives as clumsiness, then confusion, then a strange, fatal calm, and it does the last of its work on people who no longer understand that they are dying. This is why the graves fill in summer. Close to half of the people the mountain has killed died in the warm months. And the reason is not mystery but expectation. In January, everyone respects Mount Washington. They carry the gear, they watch the sky, they turn back, they assume the worst. In July, the parking lot is warm and the summit is a destination with a snack bar and a gift shop. And a hiker starts up a trail in a t-shirt on a beautiful morning, and the mountain assembles a January afternoon on top of them in the space of an hour. The forecast may have warned of it. The forecast almost always warns of it. The observatory posts the higher summit's forecast every day, and it is often blunt to the point of sounding melodramatic, and it is often right. But a warning printed on a trailhead board does not carry the same weight as a warm blue sky filling your eyes. And by the time the cloud is on you and the wind is howling through the coal, the decision to turn back is one you can no longer safely make, because the way down has become as blind and as brutal as the way up. And when rescue comes, it has to climb on foot into the exact conditions that trapped the victim, because in that wind, nothing flies. So on Mount Washington, as everywhere else in this story, the people coming to help are held back by the precise force they are coming to fight. And the mountain that a family drove halfway up in the morning is, by afternoon, killing experienced climbers a few hundred feet from the summit sign. And here is where human ambition enlarges the danger, the same way it does everywhere people decide a hostile place is worth entering. Mount Washington is not remote and it is not hard to reach, and that is exactly the problem. A road has climbed to the summit since the 1860s, and a cog railway has pushed up the other side almost as long. And every year the mountain draws enormous numbers of people, hundreds of thousands, to its top, most of them by engine, plus a steady stream of hikers on the network of trails that lace the presidential range. Accessibility is a multiplier. The easier a dangerous place is to get to, the more people get to it. And the more of them arrive with no real preparation for what it can become, because the very existence of the road and the snack bar tells them, wordlessly, that this is a safe and casual destination. It is the Smokies paradox again, worn into a summit instead of a forest. The infrastructure that makes the place easy to visit also strips away the fear that would keep people alive, and it does so most effectively on the mildest days, when the mountain looks most like the postcard and is only hours away from looking like the Arctic. The people who die here are rarely the ones who came expecting a fight. They are the ones who came for a view on a good morning and were still on the mountain when the good morning ended. There is one more thing the mountain does, and it is the quiet one. the one that closes the trap after the wind and the cold have opened it. It takes away the ability to see. When the cloud settles onto the summit, and it does so on the order of 300 days a year, the world shrinks to a few feet of gray. The cairns that mark the trail across the bare rock disappear one by one until you cannot make out the next one from the last. There is no horizon to steady your sense of up and down, no distant landmark to steer toward, no sun to tell you which way you are facing. A person in that whiteout, even a strong and experienced one, can walk a slow circle without knowing it, or stride off with total confidence in exactly the wrong direction, because every instinct we use to hold a straight line depends on references the cloud has erased. This is why people have frozen within a few hundred feet of a warm building they simply could not see, and why the oldest advice on these mountains, the same advice the Cherokee gave in the southern Appalachians, is not to move in the fog. The cloud does not just make the mountain miserable. It removes navigation itself. At the precise moment the cold turns navigation into the difference between living and dying. And when someone is caught up there, the people who go after them are volunteering to enter the same conditions that did the trapping. Rescue on Mount Washington and its neighboring peaks falls to a mix of state conservation officers and volunteer mountain rescue teams. And their work in a winter storm on that mountain is among the most dangerous rescue work in the country. They cannot fly in the wind that grounds helicopters, so they climb, on foot, into the whiteout and the cold, hauling gear, breaking trail through drifts, searching terrain where a rescuer who stops moving for too long becomes the next casualty. Rescues that would take an hour in fair weather can stretch into a day, and some of them end with the rescuers forced to turn back short of the person they came for, because to push farther into that wind and cold would only add their own names to the list. On Mount Washington, the mountain does not merely trap the lost. It sets the terms for anyone who tries to reach them, and those terms do not bend for good intentions. But the record gust is the wrong thing to fixate on, because a once-in-a-lifetime freak number is not what kills people. What kills people is that this violence is not rare here. It is routine. Hurricane force winds, that is a technical threshold, 74 miles per hour, the point at which a storm officially becomes a hurricane, are recorded on the summit of Mount Washington on average, more than 100 days a year. More than 100 days a year of what the rest of the world calls a hurricane. The observatory is fogged in, buried in cloud, roughly 300 days out of 365. And the cold does something specific and deadly when it marries that wind. The temperature does not have to be Arctic to kill. It is the combination that kills. Wind strips heat off a human body far faster than still air, and on Mount Washington the recorded wind chill has plunged to around 108 degrees below zero. At those combined values, exposed skin does not have minutes, it has less. And the wind that produces those values can rise from a stiff breeze to a killing gale in the time it takes to eat lunch. There is a physical signature of this mountain that makes the danger visible, even to someone who knows none of the numbers, and it is the tree line. On any mountain, there is an elevation above which trees cannot grow. Too cold, too windy, too brutal a growing season. And that line is a kind of natural thermometer of severity. On Mount Washington, the tree line sits astonishingly low. The forest gives up and surrenders to bare, wind-scoured alpine rock at an elevation where, in gentler ranges at the same latitude, the woods would still be thick and tall. The trees are telling you something. They are telling you that the conditions on this modest New England summit are, in their brutality, closer to the conditions found on peaks thousands of feet higher, or hundreds of miles farther north toward the Arctic. When you climb Mount Washington and step out of the last stunted, wind-bent scrub onto the open rock, you are not walking into a view. You are walking into a small piece of the subarctic that the mountain has manufactured for itself. And if the weather turns while you are up there, and it can turn in minutes, a clear morning becoming a whiteout by noon, The modest little mountain you drove partway up will try to kill you with the full toolkit of a place 4 times its size. The people who manage these mountains understand that gap between how Mount Washington looks and what it does, and at the point where the trees give out and the open alpine zone begins. There is a sign. It is blunt in a way official signs almost never allow themselves to be. It warns in plain words that the area ahead has the worst weather in America, that many people have died there from exposure even in the summer, and that if the weather is bad, you should turn back now. Turn back now. It is not advice about views or fitness. It is a plea planted at the exact line where retreat is still easy, aimed at people who feel warm and strong and are about to walk past it into the one part of the mountain that kills. And every year some of them do walk past it, because the sky is blue, and the sign feels like it must be meant for someone else, someone less prepared, the careless one. The sign is meant for exactly the person who is certain it is not meant for them, which is why nearly half of the more than 135 people who have died on this mountain died not in the teeth of winter, but in the supposedly safe months, in spring and summer and fall, when the parking lot was warm and the gift shop was open, and the danger was invisible until it wasn't. That is the trap, restated in a new key. In the Smokies, the trap was that a gentle-looking maze erased your reference. Here the trap is that a short, accessible, driven-up, gift-shopped summit can generate genuine polar violence with almost no warning. And the people who die are, over and over, people who trusted the mountain's mild appearance and its low elevation and its nearness to comfort. They start up in shorts on a beautiful morning. The cloud comes down. The wind comes up. The temperature falls off a cliff. And now they are hypothermic and blind on open rock in a hurricane, a mile from a warm building they can no longer find. And the same principle that governed everything below is governing them. Elevation was never the killer. Position was. A mountain in the wrong place, across the wrong storm tracks, shaped the wrong way, is more dangerous at 6,000 feet than a mountain twice as high, somewhere calm. So a ridge, we now know, can build its own storm out of nothing but position and wind. Sit with the implication of that, because it is the hinge of this entire story. If terrain alone can take that raw ingredient, wind, or in the Smokies, disorientation, and concentrate it into something lethal, then the question is no longer whether these old, worn, unthreatening mountains are dangerous. The question is, what happens when a genuinely large weather event, not built by the mountain, but merely delivered to it, lands on the one part of this terrain we have not yet talked about? Not the ridgetops, where a hiker gets lost or frozen, one at a time. The hollows, the narrow valley floors, down at the bottom of the labyrinth where the water goes, because that is where the people are. Not one lost hiker, whole towns. And the same channeling terrain that speeds up wind on a summit does something far more concentrated to water in a valley. And when it does not take one life at a time. It takes them by the hundreds. To understand why, you have to understand why anyone lives in a hollow in the first place, because from the outside, it looks like a mistake. These are steep, narrow valleys, walled in by ridges, prone to shadow and flood. Why build there? The answer is brutally simple, and it is the key to everything that follows. In these mountains, the valley floor is the only flat ground there is. Everywhere else is slope. If you need to lay out a house, a road, a rail line, a store, a school, a coal tipple, you need level ground. And level ground in the Appalachians exists in exactly one place, the thin ribbon at the bottom of each hollow alongside the creek. So that is where people built. Not out of foolishness, but out of geometry. The exposure is not a bad decision that some people made. It is structural. It is baked into the shape of the land. To live and work in these mountains at all is to live and work in the path of the water, because the water and the people are competing for the same scarce flat ground, and the water was there first and will be there last. And in the coal fields, that pressure took a specific, inescapable form. The coal companies did not just employ the people of these hollows. In many places, they housed them. In company towns built on company land, strung along the valley floor beside the tipple and the rail line, because that is where the work was, and that is where the flat ground was. A miner did not shop for a lot with a good view and good drainage. He lived where the company built, which was in the bottom of the hollow, below whatever the company chose to stack at the head of it. There was no safe alternative to move to, no higher ground on offer, because the higher ground was a near vertical wall of forest, and the only level land in the whole valley was the strip the water owned. So when the company piled its waste into a dam above the town, the families below were not there by accident or by carelessness. They were there because the same economics that put the dam at the head of the hollow put their homes at the foot of it, and both were built by the same hand. Now narrow the aperture to a single hollow in Logan County, West Virginia, called Buffalo Creek, in the coal fields of the southern Appalachians, and to the morning of February 26, 1972. The coal industry that built these communities also produced a problem: waste. When you mine and process coal, you are left with an enormous volume of dirty water and fine black sludge, a slurry of water and coal dust and rock, and it has to go somewhere. The common practice was to dam it up. You pile the coarse mine waste, the refuse, the gob, across the head of a hollow, and behind that barrier you pond the black slurry, and over the years the pond grows and the dam of waste grows with it. At the head of Buffalo Creek, above a string of small coal towns strung down the narrow valley, the Pittston Company's operations had built not one, but 3 of these impoundments, stacked up the hollow one behind another. The water of the upper ponds effectively backed up against the dams below. Here is where the human decisions enter, and they enter in a way that a court would later find damning. These were not engineered dams in any meaningful sense. There was, by the accounts that came out afterward, almost no real engineering behind them at all. No proper spillway designed to safely pass floodwater, no core, no careful analysis of what the pile of loose mine waste could actually hold. One dam had reportedly been laid out on the basis of little more than a sketch made by a company official on site. And they were built on top of the sludge deposits of the older impoundments, meaning the foundation itself was soft, saturated waste. This was a wall of loose rubble holding back a rising lake of water and slurry, directly above a valley full of homes and families, and it had been growing for years. To see how such a thing was allowed to exist, you have to see what these impoundments were for, and how casually they were treated. Cleaning and processing coal produces a slurry, a soup of fine coal waste, rock dust, and water, and it has to be put somewhere. The cheapest place to put it is behind a dam built out of the mine's own coarse refuse, the gob and rock left over from mining, piled across the mouth of a hollow. Do that, and the slurry ponds behind the pile, and the pile grows and the pond grows with it year after year, at almost no cost. It was ordinary practice across the coal fields, and the standard governing it was close to nothing. These structures were not designed by engineers in any rigorous sense of the word. They were built by dumping waste and letting the water rise. At Buffalo Creek, the highest of the 3 dams had been begun only a couple of years before it failed, and it had been founded not on solid ground, but directly on top of the soft sludge sediment of the older impoundments below it. There was no engineered spillway to release floodwater in a controlled way when the pond rose too high. Understand what that missing piece actually does, because it is the difference between a pond and a bomb. A properly built dam has a spillway, a designed channel that lets water escape in a controlled way, once the pond reaches a safe level, so that the water can never climb high enough to pour over the top of the dam itself. That matters enormously for a dam made of loose earth and rock, because such a dam has one great enemy, water moving over its crest, and a second, water soaking into its body. A spillway defends against both by keeping the level down. Buffalo Creek had nothing worth the name, which meant that when the rain came and the pond rose, there was no relief valve at all. The water simply climbed, and as it climbed, it soaked into the loose pile it was supposed to be held back by, saturating it, making it heavier and weaker by the hour, until the wall could no longer hold back the water or even hold up itself. There was no analysis worth the name of how much water the pile could safely hold, or of what would happen the moment it could hold no more. A company that was part of a large and profitable American corporation was storing a growing lake of industrial waste behind a bank of loose rubble on a foundation of its own mud, directly above the homes of the workers who dug its coal. 4 days before it failed, a federal mine inspector looked at the impoundment and, in the record that survives, pronounced it satisfactory. Satisfactory. Hold that word against what was coming. Reconstruct the last hours, because they are the difference between an accident and a foreseeable one. And the courts would eventually decide it was the latter. The rain that fell over those final days was heavy, but it was not a freak. It was the kind of soaking late winter rain these mountains receive most years, and it fell on ground that was already wet from earlier weather. The water behind the dams climbed, because with no real spillway, there was nowhere for it to go but up. In the dark, early morning hours, some residents and some mine employees could see that the impoundment was in trouble, that the black water was rising toward the crest of the loose pile, that the face of it was soft and beginning to slump. Word of the danger did move, in fragments, by the only means available: a knock on a door, a phone call to a neighbor, a shout in the dark. But there was no siren, there was no organized evacuation plan, there was no system built to turn one man's alarm at the dam into thousands of people out of their beds and climbing the hillsides in time. It was a Saturday morning in late February, and the valley was asleep, and the warning that existed reached only a fraction of the people who were about to be standing in the path of the water. Then it rained, not a catastrophic, unheard-of storm. A heavy but ordinary late-winter Appalachian rain, the kind these mountains get every year, falling on ground that was already wet, over about 3 days. And the water rose behind the dams, the way water rises behind any dam when the rain comes in, and there is no proper spillway to let it out. There are accounts that in the hours before the failure, some people saw the danger, that the water was climbing toward the crest of the loose waste pile, that something was wrong, and that at least some warning was raised, but there was no functioning system to translate one person's alarm into a whole valley's evacuation. And it was early on a Saturday morning, and most of the 4,000 or 5,000 people living down the hollow were in their homes, many of them still asleep. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, the uppermost dam gave way. What failed was not really a dam breaking so much as a saturated pile of waste, losing its ability to stand, slumping, and then dissolving. And when it went, it released the pond behind it in a surge. And that surge slammed into the next impoundment down, which could not hold, and that one failed into the next. The impoundments went like a row of dominoes. And everything they had been holding, something on the order of 132 million gallons of black water and slurry, was suddenly loose at the head of the hollow, with nothing between it and 16 miles of populated valley but gravity. And now the terrain, the same terrain that has been the villain of this entire story, did the one thing it does best. It channeled. 132 million gallons released onto a broad plain would have spread and slowed and thinned. Released into a narrow Appalachian hollow, it could not spread. The ridge walls held it in and forced it down, and by forcing it down, they concentrated it, drove it, built it into a moving wall of black water that witnesses described as cresting many feet high, a churning front of water and coal waste, and very quickly, the debris of the first houses it destroyed, which became battering rams for the houses below. The wave did not rise gently the way a river floods. It arrived. It came down that hollow through one small community after another. The names of those coal towns became a litany afterward. And it did in minutes what it takes a slow flood days to do. It erased them. Understand why the wave behaved the way it did, because it is the same principle that has run through every mechanism in this story, now turned lethal in the most direct way imaginable. A flood on a broad plain spreads sideways, and spreading is what saps its power, because the same volume of water thinned across a wide area is shallow and slow. A narrow hollow forbids spreading. The ridge walls are a fixed channel, and a fixed channel can only send the water one way, forward and down. So instead of thinning, the flood stacks up on itself and drives. The uppermost community in the path, a place called Saunders, sat closest to the dams and took the surge at nearly its full, undiminished violence. And Denitsspellens, and Saunders did not flood so much as cease to exist, swept from its own ground. Below it, the wave did not weaken the way a normal flood weakens, because the hollow kept feeding its energy forward, and it picked up the wreckage of each community it destroyed and carried that wreckage as a battering front into the next, so that houses downstream were struck not only by water, but by the shattered remains of the houses above them. 16 communities strung down some 17 miles of valley, and the wave went through them in a matter of hours, arriving at each one, not as a rising tide anyone could climb away from, but as a wall. Hold on to what the morning actually was for the people in it, because the casualty figures are about to arrive, and the mind slides off figures. At first light on that Saturday, 4,000 or 5,000 people lay asleep in their homes down a single narrow valley, ordinary coal country families, on the one flat ground the mountains had ever offered them, with no reason to think this rainy weekend was any different from 100 rainy weekends before it. The wave gave most of them no rising water to climb away from, no slow warning to run from. It arrived as a wall, in the time it takes to cross a room, and it took whole households in a single instant. What it left behind was a field of black mud and a silence that survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe, and never quite could. When it was over, the count was 125 people dead, more than 1,000 injured, over 4,000 left homeless in a single morning, hundreds of homes destroyed outright, an entire string of communities up and down a 16-mile hollow reduced to mud and wreckage, and the strange, total silence that follows a flash flood. Whole families were gone. The water that had been sitting placidly behind a wall of mine waste at dawn had by mid-morning rewritten the census of an entire valley. And then came the second failure, the human one. And it is the reason Buffalo Creek is not merely a tragedy, but a proof. The Pittston Company's public position was that the disaster was, in the phrase that has never been forgotten by the people of that hollow, an act of God. An unforeseeable natural event, the rain for which no company could be held responsible. But the rain was not unforeseeable. The rain was ordinary. What was extraordinary was the wall of loose waste with no spillway, built on a foundation of sludge, on a sketch, above a valley full of sleeping families, and pronounced satisfactory 4 days earlier. The investigations that followed, by the state, and the analysis that fed into federal mine safety reform, did not agree that this was an act of God. They found a man-made structure that had failed because of how it was made and where it was placed, a failure that was foreseeable and with real engineering preventable. In the legal reckoning that followed, The survivors' claims were pursued and settled, and the disaster became one of the case studies that drove a tightening of federal law governing exactly these coal waste impoundments, so that the next hollow full of families might not be sitting under the next wall of loose slurry. The reckoning did not stop at the water's edge. A group of survivors, represented by a lawyer named Gerald Stern, sued the company in federal court, and the case became one of the landmark disaster litigation stories in American law. Not only for the money, a settlement on the order of $13.5 million, but for what the plaintiffs argued and the record supported. They argued that the company had known, or plainly should have known, that the impoundment was unsafe, that the act of God defense was an evasion of responsibility, and that the injury reached beyond the drowned and the flattened houses into the survivors themselves. A sociologist who studied the community in the years afterward documented what he called collective trauma, the tearing apart not just of bodies and buildings, but of the dense web of relationships that had made those coal towns a functioning community. People who lived through the wave described a fear of rain, of rising water, of the ordinary sound of the creek that never fully left them. The hollow that had concentrated the flood into a weapon had also concentrated the grief, because in a valley that narrow everyone knew everyone, and the dead were not strangers. They were neighbors and cousins and children. A whole community's worth of them lost in a single morning, and the ones who survived had to go on living in the exact place where it had happened. And the disaster changed the law, which is the one thread of repair running through it. Buffalo Creek fed directly into a tightening of the rules governing coal waste impoundments and mine safety, the kind of federal inspection, engineering standards, and enforcement whose absence had built the wall in the first place, and its lessons carried forward into later legislation governing surface mining and the reclamation of mined land. Whether that reform touched the fundamental system or only one part of it is a fair and uncomfortable question. The engineering standards got better. The inspections got real teeth. But the deeper cause, communities with no choice but to live on the valley floor beneath whatever the industry and the weather stacked above them, did not change, and could not change, because the geography did not change. You can regulate the wall. You cannot move the hollow, and you cannot move the people out of the only flat ground there is. The exposure stayed exactly where the terrain had always put it, which is why the next chapter of this story is not about one dam at all. It is about what happens when the wall that fails is the sky itself, and it falls on every hollow at once. But look at what Buffalo Creek actually proves, because it is a step beyond everything before it. In the Smokies and on Mount Washington, the danger was terrain plus weather, a natural system that killed people who misread it. Buffalo Creek is terrain plus weather plus decisions. The hollow concentrated the water, yes. The rain filled the pond, yes. But the wall that failed was built by people, approved by people, and defended afterward by people, and the 125 dead were the product of geography and human choice acting together. The terrain that hides a lost hiker is the same terrain that funnels floodwater into a weapon, and here human beings loaded that weapon and left the safety off. Danger in these mountains is co-produced. It is never only the land. And once you see that the shape of the land turns an ordinary rain into a 132 million gallon wave the moment a human decision fails, you have to ask the largest and last version of the question this whole story has been building toward. Buffalo Creek was one hollow, one dam, one company, one morning. A local failure with a local cause. But the terrain that channeled that water is not local. It runs the entire length of these mountains, thousands of hollows, hundreds of valleys, a continent-scale network of channels all pointing downhill. So what happens? What actually happens? When the failure is not one dam, but the sky itself, and the whole range floods at once. We found out in September of 2024. Her name was Helene. To understand why Hurricane Helene did what it did to the southern Appalachians, you have to abandon the idea that a hurricane is a coastal problem. It made landfall on the Gulf Coast of Florida, yes, a large and powerful storm. But hurricanes weaken over land, and by the ordinary logic of these things, a Florida landfall should have meant a fading storm and some heavy rain for the interior. That is not what happened. And the reason it is not what happened is the reason this whole documentary exists. The mountains took an ordinary threat and, through their shape and position, turned it into something the region had no precedent for. Two things had to line up, and they did. First, in the days before Helene's core arrived, a separate weather system had already been parked over the southern Appalachians, wringing rain out of the sky across September 25th and 26th, soaking the ground, filling the soil and the creeks and the rivers before the main event even showed up. The sponge was already saturated. There was no capacity left in the ground to absorb anything more. This is the part that most people miss when they think of Helene as a single event. The killing blow had already been half-loaded before the hurricane itself ever reached the mountains. In the 2 days before Helene's core arrived, a stalled front draped across the southern Appalachians and drew tropical moisture up ahead of the storm, and it rained and rained over the 25th and the 26th of September, dropping many inches across the high country before the main event even showed on the horizon. On flat ground, that early rain would have been a serious storm, and no more. On these slopes, it did something worse than flood. It filled the ground. Soil can only hold so much water before it behaves like pavement, shedding everything that lands on it straight into the streams, and it can only cling to the slope as long as it is not too heavy and too lubricated to hold. By the time Helene proper drove north into the mountains, the ground was already at its limit on both counts, primed to shed every drop of the coming deluge directly into the hollows, and, on the steepest slopes, primed to let go entirely and slide. The hurricane did not arrive to a fresh landscape. It arrived to a trap that a quieter storm had already set. And the saturated ground did not only feed the rivers. It came off the mountains directly. When a slope holds more water than it can bear, the soil loses its grip on the rock beneath it, and the whole face of the hillside can let go at once. A landslide that in these mountains often takes the form of a debris flow, a fast, dense slurry of mud, boulders, and shattered trees that pours down a drainage with the speed of a car and the mass of a moving building. Across western North Carolina, Helene tore loose thousands of these slides. They buried roads, they dammed streams, and then broke and released them in surges. And worst of all, they came down on homes. This is a second and separate way the terrain kills, distinct from the rivers rising in the valley bottoms. A house does not have to be beside a swollen creek to be destroyed. It only has to be below a slope that gives way, and in a landscape that is almost nothing but slope, that is a great many houses. Families who thought they were safely above the flood, up out of the valley floor, learned that the high ground has its own way of coming down. The water that drowns the hollows and the earth that slides off the ridges are the same water, doing the same thing, from opposite directions, and between them they left very little ground in these mountains that could honestly be called safe. And then Helene drove north into that pre-soaked terrain, carrying an enormous load of tropical moisture up from the warm Gulf. And the mountains did to that moisture-laden air exactly what they had done to the wind on Mount Washington and the water in Buffalo Creek. They forced it up. When a mass of wet air is pushed against a mountain range, it has to rise to get over. And as it rises, it cools. And as it cools, it cannot hold its water, so it rains it out. All of it. In the same places. For as long as the flow keeps coming. Meteorologists call it orographic lift. But you do not need the term. You have already seen the principle 3 times in this story. The mountain forces the medium to concentrate. On the summit, it concentrated wind. In the hollow, it concentrated a broken dam. Now, across the whole Blue Ridge escarpment, it concentrated a hurricane's worth of tropical moisture and wrung it out over western North Carolina like a fist closing on a soaked sponge. The rainfall totals that came out of that mechanism were not in the normal range, and then a little higher. They were off the scale. Parts of the mountains recorded over 30 inches of rain. 30 inches. On top of ground that was already full, falling into thousands of hollows and hundreds of valleys, every one of them a channel, every one of them pointing downhill toward a town built on the only flat ground available. And so Buffalo Creek happened everywhere, all at once. The rivers that drain these mountains, the Swannanoa, the French Broad, the Nolichucky, and dozens more, did not flood in the slow way of lowland rivers, creeping up over days. They flashed. The water came off the slopes faster than the channels could carry it, and the channels, hemmed in by the same steep terrain that had funneled everything else in this story, concentrated it into surges that tore through the valley floors. The Swannanoa River rose into a torrent that scoured entire communities off their foundations. Towns along the rivers of western North Carolina were not damaged. Some were, in the most literal sense, erased. The flat valley ground they stood on stripped down to rock and mud, the buildings, the roads, the bridges gone. There were dozens of separate flash flood emergencies declared across the region in a single stretch of hours, each one its own Buffalo Creek, each one a valley's worth of water, arriving faster than anyone in its path could move. Put names to it, because the scale hides the specifics, and the specifics are where the horror lives. The Swannanoa River, which runs through the valley towns just east of Asheville, rose to a level never before recorded and scoured the community that shares its name, along with the historic mill village of Biltmore, dragging away homes and businesses that had stood for a century. The French Broad, one of the oldest rivers on the continent, drowned the arts district of Asheville under feet of water and mud, swallowing whole buildings. The Nolichucky, squeezed through its gorge, ran at a volume that observers compared to the flow of Niagara, and it piled against a hydroelectric dam upstream with such violence that the possible failure of that dam became its own separate, frantic emergency, threatening to add an engineered flood on top of the natural one. Small mountain towns that most of the country had never heard of, Chimney Rock, Bat Cave, Spruce Pine, Marshall, Hot Springs, were gutted. Their main streets turned into river channels, their bridges torn out. This was not one flood. It was scores of them, firing at the same moment out of scores of hollows, and the National Weather Service was issuing flash flood emergencies, its rarest and most dire flood warning, faster than the region could even absorb the news, an unprecedented cluster of them across a single day, each one a separate valley meeting its own private version of what Buffalo Creek had suffered 52 years before. Except that this time, no one had built a dam. The sky was the dam, and it had failed everywhere. It helps to understand what moving water actually does to a human being, because people underestimate it in a way that kills them, and the numbers are not intuitive. Water is heavy, far heavier than air, and moving water carries a force that rises sharply with its speed. Fast-flowing water only about 6 inches deep, barely past the ankle, is enough to knock a grown adult off their feet. And once a person is off their feet in a current, they are no longer a person standing in a flood. They are debris. Water 2 feet deep, moving with any real speed, will lift and carry a car. So when a flash flood comes down a mountain hollow, The danger is not the eventual depth you picture, some slow rise you could wade out of. It is the speed. And the speed in these hollows is extreme, because the same steep, funneling terrain that concentrates the volume also accelerates the flow, turning what would be a survivable rise on flat ground into a moving wall that takes the road, the car, and the person standing on the road in the same second. This is why people die in their vehicles trying to cross a flooded road that looks passable, and why residents who thought they had time to gather belongings did not. In this terrain, the water does not creep. It charges, and it arrives with the mass of a landslide and the reach of a river, and a few inches of it moving fast is all the difference between standing on your own ground and being swept off it. And the water that sweeps them off is cold, which does its own separate killing. Even in the warm months, the water pouring off these mountains in a flood is cold, fed by rain falling through mountain air and running off shaded slopes, and cold water pulls heat out of a human body many times faster than cold air at the same temperature. A person swept into a flood is not only fighting the current and the debris. They are being chilled toward helplessness at a speed that has nothing to do with the season, their muscles stiffening, their grip weakening, the clear thinking they need to survive draining out of them within minutes. This is why strong swimmers still drown in floods, and why survival in moving water is so often a matter of a few minutes before the cold makes swimming impossible. The flood does not need to hold a person under for long. It only needs to hold them long enough for the cold to finish the work the current started. Asheville, North Carolina, is the largest city in these mountains, and in the years before Helene, it had acquired a reputation and even a marketing label as a kind of climate haven, a place high and inland and temperate, insulated, people thought, from the coastal storms and the extremes that were battering other regions. Helene demolished that idea in a single day. And it was not merely a marketing label. People had been moving to these mountains precisely to get away from disaster, retirees, and remote workers, and families leaving the hurricane coasts and the wildfire zones and the baking cities, choosing Asheville and the towns around it because the mountains felt like high ground in every sense, a refuge from a changing climate. The cruel joke Helene told is that there is no such refuge, and that the very feature that made the region feel safe, its walls of high terrain, is the feature that turned a hurricane's reign into a regional catastrophe. The people who came to these mountains to escape the weather had moved, without knowing it, into the one machine on the continent best built to concentrate it. Safety was the assumption. The terrain was the reality. And the terrain had been waiting a very long time. The floodwaters and the landslides cut the city off. The water system failed, and it failed in a way that shows how these mountains turn a flood into a siege that outlasts the water. Asheville draws most of its drinking water from a reservoir high in the mountains above the city, fed by protected forest. And that arrangement had always been a point of pride. Clean mountain water by gravity. Helene turned the strength into the wound. The storm scoured so much sediment off the saturated slopes that the reservoir turned thick and brown, and the great pipelines that carry the water down to the city were damaged and buried by the same slides and floods that were tearing up everything else. So a modern American city of tens of thousands was left not for a day or two, but for weeks, without safe running water, unable to drink from its taps, unable to flush, hospitals and homes alike reduced to bottled water and tanker trucks and buckets hauled from creeks, because the mountain that had always delivered the water for free had, in a single night, cut the line and fouled the source at the same time. Power failed, and the cellular network failed. And here, at the largest possible scale, we meet the ghost of Geraldine Largay again, because a whole region was suddenly in the exact situation she had been in alone on that main hillside. Unable to call for help, the invisible web of signal gone, cut off not by remoteness, but by the collapse of the infrastructure That remoteness had always threatened. People could not reach the outside world to say they were alive. Families outside could not reach in to learn whether the people they loved had survived. The connection simply was not there. And the roads. This is the detail that ties Helene back to Dennis Martin across 55 years, because it is the oldest lesson in this story wearing modern clothes. In 1969, the rain washed out the dirt roads and slowed the searchers trying to reach a lost boy. In 2024, the water dissolved the modern highway system of an entire region. Interstate highways buckled and collapsed. Mountain roads were undercut and swept away by the thousands. Bridges were gone. And the consequence was the same consequence this documentary has been proving from the first sentence, now at the scale of 100,000 square miles. The distance between people in trouble and the help meant to reach them became, for a time, uncrossable. Communities were physically severed. The only way into some of them was by air, and helicopters flew in the same role that a rescue helicopter had flown over Spence Field in 1969. The tool of last resort when the ground itself has closed. Supplies, evacuations, and rescues had to go by aircraft and by mule, and on foot into valleys that no longer had a road. Understand what losing the roads actually meant, hour by hour. Because it is the whole argument of this story compressed into one region's worst week. Through the Pigeon River Gorge, one of the main interstate arteries connecting North Carolina to Tennessee was undercut and torn apart. Whole lanes of highway shearing off and dropping into the swollen river, severing a primary route through the mountains that had taken years to build and would take years to rebuild. Thousands of secondary roads and mountain lanes were washed out, undercut, or buried under landslides. Bridges, the single points of failure that connect a hollow to the rest of the world, were gone by the hundreds. And so entire communities were not merely damaged, but marooned, sealed off with no road in or out, no power, no running water, no cell signal, no way to tell anyone they were alive or to learn whether help was coming or even knew they existed. The response had to be improvised in 3 dimensions because 2 of them had been destroyed. Helicopters flew rescues and dropped pallets of supplies into valleys that had become islands. And when weather grounded the aircraft, people organized mule and horse teams. An old mountain technology pressed abruptly back into service to carry food, water, insulin, and oxygen up trails and washed-out roadbeds to people the modern supply chain could no longer reach. Think about that. In the most connected society in human history, in the 21st century, the way to save a stranded mountain community was, for a while, a string of pack animals walking a footpath, which is very nearly how you would have reached that same community 200 years earlier, because the terrain had reached up and reset the clock. And the distance that has been the killer in every chapter of this story was, once again, the thing that no technology could shorten. The death toll from Helene across the region climbed past 200, with North Carolina alone accounting for more than 100 of the dead, most of them in these mountains, most of them from the water. Sit with where those people died because it overturns what most of us assume about hurricanes. We picture a hurricane as a coastal event, a wall of wind and storm surge slamming a beach, and we picture the danger fading as the storm moves inland and weakens. Helene inverted that completely. It made landfall on the Florida coast, but the great majority of the people it killed died hundreds of miles inland in the mountains, days into the storm's life, and not from wind, but from fresh water, from rivers and creeks and hillsides. That is not a quirk of this one storm. Across the decades, a very large share of the people killed by hurricanes in the United States have died not from wind or storm surge at the coast, but from inland freshwater flooding, often far from the sea, when the storm's rain lands on terrain that gathers it and drives it, and there is no terrain in the eastern United States better built to gather it and drive it than these mountains. The coast braces for the hurricane. The mountains, hundreds of miles from the sea, are where it does much of its worst killing, and almost no one living there thinks of themselves as standing in a hurricane's path at all. And here is the reversal that makes Helene the darkest and most important case in this entire story, the one that should change how you understand every case before it. The forecasting worked. This was not 1972, when a hollow full of families had no functioning warning at all. The National Weather Service saw Helene coming. The forecasts were a massive scam by the accounts of the meteorologists who studied the event afterward, accurate and timely. The warnings of catastrophic, life-threatening flooding went out ahead of the water. The system did its job, and people died anyway, in the hundreds, because a warning is only worth something if the people who receive it have a way to act on it. And the same terrain that concentrated the rain into a flood had also built the roads that the flood destroyed, so that in the crucial hours, a correct, timely warning arrived to people who, increasingly, had nowhere to go and no way to get there. Warning is not the same as escape. Knowing the water is coming does you no good if every road out of your hollow is already underwater or already gone. That is the final, brutal refinement of the lesson. We closed the gap in knowing, and the gap in reaching stayed exactly as wide as the mountains made it. Follow a rescue through its actual stages, and you see where the mountains break it, because a rescue is not a single act. It is a chain, and a chain fails at its weakest link. First, someone has to recognize that a specific person or a specific community is in trouble, and in Helene that recognition was crippled from the start because the cell network was down, and the people who most needed help were the very people who could no longer send word that they needed it. Then someone has to authorize and organize a response and gather the right assets, air crews, swift water teams, supplies, which takes hours, even when everything works. Then those assets have to travel to the scene, and here the mountains simply severed the chain. The roads that rescuers would have driven were gone, so the only way in was to fly, and flying depended on weather that kept grounding the aircraft. Then, having reached the general area, the rescuers have to actually search the broken ground and find the specific people in valleys stripped of landmarks and choked with debris. Then they have to approach them, across water still running or slopes still sliding. Then they have to transfer them to safety, one at a time, by helicopter hoist or by carrying them out on foot, which is slow and dangerous and cannot be done at scale. Every one of those stages takes time, and every stage the mountains attacked at once, and time was the one thing the people trapped in the hollows did not have. This is the anatomy of why a correct, timely warning still ended in hundreds of deaths. The warning cleared the first hurdle. The terrain rebuilt every hurdle after it, higher than before. And there is a piece of this that the word rescue hides, which is that the rescuers themselves were in the water. Swiftwater rescue in flash flood conditions is one of the most dangerous jobs in emergency response, because moving floodwater does not care who is trained and who is not. And a rescuer wading or boating into a debris-choked torrent to reach a stranded family is exposed to the same force that stranded them. Across these mountains, in Helene and in the smaller floods that came before it, the people going in after the trapped have been swept away, injured, and killed doing it. That is the part the neat word rescue erases. It is not help arriving from outside the danger. It is people choosing to enter the danger, into the same channels, the same current, the same collapsing ground, and sometimes not coming back out. The distance that has to be crossed is not just long. It is lethal to cross, which is the deepest reason it stays uncrossed until it is too late. There is a climate dimension to Helene, and it deserves to be stated carefully, without exaggeration, because the physics is real and the physics is enough. Warmer air holds more moisture. That is not a theory. It is a basic, measurable property of the atmosphere. For each degree of warming, the air can carry several % more water. A warmer Gulf feeds more moisture into a storm, and a warmer atmosphere delivers more of it. And the mechanism these mountains have always used, forcing wet air up and wringing it dry, has more water to work with than it used to. That does not mean these mountains were ever safe and are only now dangerous. Buffalo Creek and Dennis Martin and 135 graves on Mount Washington are proof they were always dangerous. It means the ceiling on how bad the water event can get is rising. And it is rising in a place whose terrain is uniquely built to convert rain into a weapon, and whose people are structurally settled in the exact channels that weapon flows down. Be concrete about the physics, because it is not speculation, and it does not need to be exaggerated to be frightening. The relationship between temperature and atmospheric moisture is one of the best established numbers in all of meteorology. For roughly every degree Celsius of warming, the air can hold on the order of 7% more water vapor. 7% does not sound like much until you understand that it compounds through the whole chain. A warmer Gulf of Mexico evaporates more water into the storm. A warmer atmosphere carries more of it north. And the orographic mechanism that these mountains have always used, forcing that wet air up the escarpment and wringing it dry, now has more water to wring. The rain events that were already possible here become heavier. The heavier ones become the kind that erase towns. Analyses of Helene by climate scientists after the fact concluded that the extraordinary rainfall was made meaningfully heavier and more likely by the warming that has already occurred, not caused from nothing, but loaded, amplified, pushed further into the tail of what the region had ever seen. That is the honest way to say it. Warming did not invent the danger. The danger was always latent in this terrain. As Buffalo Creek and every drowned hollow before it proved, warming raised the ceiling on how bad the water can get in the one landscape on the continent whose every ridge and hollow is built to convert rain into a weapon, and whose people are structurally settled in the exact channels the weapon flows down. Scientists have a phrase for a disaster that is physically possible, but so far outside a region's lived experience that no one is prepared for it: a gray swan. Helene was, for the interior southern Appalachians, close to that. A catastrophe the terrain had always been capable of producing, delivered by an atmosphere increasingly capable of loading it, arriving in a place that had been telling itself, right up until the water came, that it was safe. There is a pattern hiding underneath all of this that is easy to miss, and it is the darkest thing technology does in a dangerous place. Every improvement in our ability to survive these mountains has also been an invitation to enter them more and further, and with less fear. Better forecasting lets more people plan trips into terrain that used to be left alone. Better roads and stronger cars carry more people deeper into the hollows and higher up the peaks. Reliable water and power and cell service let more people settle places that were once too hard to live in. A phone in the pocket makes a solo hiker feel safe on a trail that a generation ago would have demanded a partner. None of these things is bad on its own, but each of them quietly widens the circle of people exposed and pushes that circle further into the danger, and raises the number of lives riding on the assumption that the capability will hold. And then, on the day the capability fails, when the signal drops, or the road washes out, or the correct forecast arrives with no time left to act on it, there are simply more people, in worse places, leaning on a safety that was never as solid as it felt. The technology did not make the mountains safe. It made more of us comfortable enough to stand in front of them. So let us close the loops. because we opened several and honesty requires accounting for each one. Will Dennis Martin ever be found? Almost certainly not, and we still do not know what happened to him. The abduction theory was never confirmed, and the FBI found no evidence of foul play. And after more than 50 years, the only honest verdict is that a 6-year-old walked into the forest and the forest never gave him back. Did modern technology end the disorientation that killed in 1969? No. Geraldine Largay closed that loop with a cell phone in her hand 2 miles from the trail. Is elevation the danger on these mountains? No. Mount Washington closed that loop with more than 135 dead on a summit you can drive to, because position, not height, is what kills. Was the water risk natural or man-made? Both, and the distinction is the point. Buffalo Creek closed that loop by proving that the terrain's natural power to concentrate water becomes lethal precisely when human decisions fail, and that a court could rule the result foreseeable. And can forecasting save the valley? Helene closed that last loop in the hardest possible way. The forecast was right, and the warning was timely, and the people died anyway, because a warning without a road out is just advance notice of a death you cannot prevent. Now stand back and look at the whole machine, because that is what it is. A machine. And every case in this story is the same machine running with different inputs. The geography sets the constraints, an eroded labyrinth of repeating ridges and drowning hollows, with no sight lines and no reference, and only one strip of flat ground to live on. And that strip is the floor of a channel. The weather activates those constraints. It converges its storm tracks over the peaks, it drives its wind and its water up against the ridges, and the mountains concentrate whatever the weather brings. Human motive creates the exposure. We hike the ridges for the endurance and the view. We settle the hollows because there is nowhere else flat. We mine and build and travel and vacation in the one landscape that is engineered by nature to concentrate force onto exactly where we are standing. Technology changes what we can do, but not what the mountains can do. It lets us call and forecast and drive and fly. And it fails at the one thing that has never changed, which is the raw distance and the broken ground between a person in trouble and the help that is coming. Distance limits the rescue every single time, from 1,400 searchers who found no trace of a boy to a dog team 100 yards from a living woman, to helicopters flying because the interstates were gone. And history proves the repetition because this is not a series of accidents. It is one pattern, expressed across a child in 1969, a hiker in 2013, a mountain that has been killing since the 1800s, a dam in 1972, and a hurricane in 2024. The inputs change, the machine does not. And notice how the scale climbs while the mechanism holds perfectly still. It starts with one child, lost in 3 minutes. Then one prepared hiker, alone, for 26 days. Then a single modest summit that has quietly taken more than 135 lives, 1 and 2 at a time, across a century and a half. Then a valley, 125 gone in a single morning. Then a whole region, hundreds dead across a single week, entire towns scrubbed off their ground. The number the trap takes at once keeps rising, from 1 to 100 to hundreds, and the trap itself does not change at all. Same terrain, same convergence of weather onto that terrain, same single strip of livable ground, same distance no rescue can close in time. What grows is not the danger's nature, but its reach. And the thing that lets its reach grow is us, more of us, in more of the hollows and on more of the ridges, under a warming sky that loads the clouds a little heavier with every passing decade. The most unsettling part is how little any of it has actually changed the behavior. And this is where the story has to end. Not on a lesson, but on a fact, because the machine is still running right now, exactly as it always has, and the people are still walking into it. Not out of ignorance, most of them, but out of the same ordinary human reasons they always have. The view is worth the ridge. The endurance is worth the trail. The flat ground is the only ground there is, and a home has to stand somewhere. And after the water goes down, the somewhere is still the valley floor, because it was always the valley floor. So picture it, because this is where it comes to rest. Each spring, at a trail shelter high on the spine of the Smokies, the register book fills again with fresh signatures. The names and the dates and the little notes of people setting out along the same ridges where a boy vanished and a woman who did everything right still died. And most of them will be fine, and a few of them, statistically across the years, will not. And no one signing the book can tell you which. Down below, on the valley floors of western North Carolina, in the hollows the water erased, the sound of hammers has already started again. New houses are rising on the same flat ground, beside the same rivers, beneath the same convergent storm tracks, in the same channels that pointed the flood downhill. Not because anyone forgot, because the ground is the only ground there is. The geography has not moved. The storm tracks have not moved. The Gulf is a little warmer than it was. The register book is blank at the top of the next page, and the mountains are patient, and the ledger is open, and it is waiting for the next name.